Drive. Phil's studio had never been quieter than on that afternoon of taping. The lights, normally calibrated to create a welcoming yet professional atmosphere, seemed colder, as if the technical equipment itself sensed that something different was about to happen. In the audience, 250 people waited in their seats, murmuring amongst themselves about the theme of the episode, which had been announced only as the survivor tells her story. No one there could have imagined that, in the next 2 hours, they would witness one of the most impactful moments in the show's history. Phil walked down the side corridor of the studio with a navy blue folder in his hands. His producers had handed him the dossier on the day's guest just 48 hours ago, and since then, the veteran host hadn't been able to sleep properly. In over 20 years of television career, Phil McGraw had heard stories of abuse, crimes, betrayals, and family tragedies of every imaginable kind. But there was something about this particular case that disturbed him in a way he couldn't fully explain. The guest was named Rachel Morrison, a 34-year-old woman who had escaped a religious sect known as the Divine Light just 18 months prior. For 15 years, Rachel had lived completely isolated from the outside world in a closed community in the mountains of northern Colorado, under the command of a man who called himself Pastor Elijah Crane. What made this case particularly devastating was the fact that Rachel had been brought into the sect at the age of 17 by her own aunt, who believed she was saving her niece from a life of sin. But the real reason this episode would forever change the trajectory of the show wasn't in the dossier Dr. Phil was carrying. It was in a yellowed envelope Rachel kept hidden in her purse, a letter she'd found sewn into the lining of her own Bible. Weeks before she managed to escape the compound, a letter written in code by the cult leader himself, containing a truth so disturbing it would make even the most controlled man on American television break down in tears before millions of viewers. Before we continue with this impactful story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of Dr. Phil's upcoming revelations. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think will happen in this case. Your opinion is very important for us to continue bringing you this exclusive content that transforms lives. The curtains opened and Dr. Phil took his usual position center stage, facing the 2 chairs where guests usually sat. That day, however, there was only one chair. The production had decided that Rachel needed space, air, distance from any other presence that wasn't absolutely necessary. Backstage, 3 psychologists were on standby, something that rarely happened during regular recordings. Today we're going to talk about a topic that deeply affects me, Dr. Phil began, his deep voice echoing through the silent studio. Abusive religious cults and sects destroy families, steal identities, and leave scars that often never fully heal. Our guest today spent 15 years of her life trapped in a nightmare, from which she believed she would never escape. In the audience, some people were already wiping away tears. The video introduction that had been shown moments before displayed archival footage of the Divine Light Complex barbed wire fences, makeshift watchtowers, and the blank faces of women dressed in identical gray outfits. Working in fields under the scorching sun, Rachel Morrison walked slowly onto the stage, as if each step required a conscious effort. She was too thin for her height, with short, irregularly cut brown hair she had cut it herself. She would later explain, because she could no longer bear the weight of the long hair she was forced to keep in the cult. Her eyes, a grayish blue, seemed both present and distant, as if part of her were still trapped in those Colorado mountains. Phil stood to greet her, something he didn't do often. "Rachel, thank you for being here. I know it wasn't easy accepting this invitation." "It wasn't," she replied, her voice almost a whisper amplified by the microphones. "But I needed to tell this story. Not for me, for them." The presenter frowned. "Because of them?" Rachel nodded, but didn't elaborate. She sat in the chair and crossed her hands in her lap, her fingers intertwined so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Phil, I watched your show for years before. Before I went there, my mother watched it every afternoon. I grew up hearing you say that the truth is the only path to healing, and it is," confirmed Dr. Phil, leaning forward in his chair. "The truth is always the first step. So I need you to understand that what I'm going to tell you today is the truth, the whole truth, even the parts that will make you want to stop the recording." A heavy silence fell over the studio. In the control booth, the producers exchanged nervous glances. This was not a rehearsed line. Rachel had been prepared for the interview. She had gone through preliminary sessions with the show's team of psychologists, but no one had mentioned anything about stopping the recording. Phil maintained his characteristic composure. Rachel, I'm here to listen. No matter what you have to say, we'll get through this together. Tell me about how you came to the divine light. Rachel took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was an ironclad determination in her gaze that hadn't been there seconds before. I was 17 years old. It was 2008. Maya Margaret, my mother's sister, had converted to Pastor Elijah's movement 2 years earlier. She visited our house in Denver once a month and always talked about how she had found peace, purpose, a real family. My mother thought it was strange, but she didn't want to create conflict with her sister. And your parents? Where were they in all of this? My father died when I was 12, cancer. My mother worked 2 jobs to support us, me and my younger brother, Tommy. She was rarely home. I took care of Tommy, cooked, cleaned the house. I was practically an adult before I was old enough, doctor. Phil nodded. You were vulnerable, overwhelmed, searching for something to give meaning to your life. Exactly. And Maya knew that. She knew exactly what to say. Rachel paused, swallowing hard. In March 2008, she invited me to spend a weekend at the compound. She said it would be like a spiritual retreat, that I could rest, meditate, find peace. My mother hesitated, but I begged. I was so tired, Phil. So tired of everything. And what happened when you got there? Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. The first day was wonderful. Everyone was kind. The food was good. People sang, prayed together, treated me as if I were special. Pastor Elijah called me for a private conversation on the second day. He was unlike anyone I had ever met. Different how? He had this ability to make you feel like you were the only person in the world who mattered. When he looked at you, it was like he could see your soul. He told me things about myself that no one had ever noticed before: my grief over my father's death, my anger at my mother for never being there, my fear of failure. It was like he could read my mind, doctor. Phil was well acquainted with this technique. It's called cold reading. Trained manipulators can extract information through subtle questions and body language, and then present that information as if it were supernatural revelations. I know that now, Rachel said, her voice taking on a bitter tone. But at 17, I thought I had found God. That Pastor Elijah was his messenger on earth. When the weekend ended, I didn't want to leave. And your mother? My aunt called her. She said I had decided to stay a few more days, that I was undergoing spiritual healing. A week turned into a month turned into a year. After some time, they confiscated my phone. They said that contact with the outside world was a distraction, a temptation of evil that would try to drag me back into darkness. In the audience, several people shook their heads in denial, some with their hands over their mouths. Rachel's story was, unfortunately, terribly common, but that didn't make it any less devastating. Rachel, I need to ask you something difficult, said Dr. Phil, his voice soft but firm. During these 15 years, was there physical abuse? Sexual abuse? The silence that followed was the most eloquent answer possible. Rachel lowered her eyes to her hands, still clasped in her lap, and when she spoke again, her voice was almost inaudible. Pastor Elijah had spiritual wives, 12 in total, women chosen by him to carry his sacred seed and continue his divine lineage. She looked up, meeting Dr. Phil's eyes with an almost painful intensity. I became the 13th when I turned 18, a month after my birthday, Dr. Phil closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. When he opened them again, there was a controlled anger in his expression, not directed at Rachel, but at the man who had destroyed his youth. Rachel, did you have children during those 15 years? The question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Rachel didn't answer immediately. Her lips trembled, and for the first time since she had stepped onto the stage, a tear rolled down her face. I had a daughter, she finally said, Lily. She was born in 2012. She had the most beautiful eyes I've ever seen, green, like my mother's. I loved her from the first moment I held her in my arms. Where is Lily now? Rachel shook her head slowly. They told me she died, a fever, when she was 3 years old. They said God had called her back to heaven because she was too pure for this world. I couldn't see the body. I couldn't say goodbye. Pastor Elijah said it would be too painful, that I needed to accept God's will. The audience was in absolute silence. There were no murmurs, no movements. It was as if 250 people had stopped breathing simultaneously. Did you believe them? For years, yes. What else could I do? They controlled everything: what I ate, when I slept, who I talked to. I had no access to any information from the outside world. I had no choice but to believe. Doctor. Phil leaned even further forward, his eyes fixed on Rachel's. You said for years. What changed? Rachel reached for the bag she had kept by her side throughout the conversation. Her fingers trembled visibly as she unzipped it. 18 months ago, shortly before I managed to escape, I found something. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about that place, about Pastor Elijah, about my daughter. She pulled a yellowed envelope from her bag, folded in half, with worn marks on the edges. The paper looked old, as if it had been handled hundreds of times. This was sewn inside the cover of my Bible, the same Bible that Pastor Elijah gave me the day I became his spiritual wife. I only discovered it because the stitching started to come undone after years of use. Doctor. Phil extended his hand. Can I see? Rachel hesitated. Before I hand this over, Doctor. Phil, I need you to understand one thing. What's written in this letter? It's not what you're expecting. It's not a confession of crimes. It's not a list of victims. It's something far worse. What do you mean by much worse? I want to say that when you read this, you'll understand why I needed to come here. Why I couldn't just hand this over to the police and move on with my life. She paused, taking a deep breath. This letter wasn't written to be found by just anyone. It was written to be found by me. And when you read it, you'll understand that it was also written for you. The envelope remained in Rachel's hands for a few more seconds, as if she were gathering courage for the next step. Doctor. Phil waited patiently, his decades of experience telling him that pressing at that moment would be counterproductive. Some truths need to emerge in their own time. Before I show you the letter, Rachel continued, I need to tell you what happened in the months before I ran away. You need to understand the context. I'm listening. In 2022, things started to change at the compound. Pastor Elijah was different, more distant. He would spend days locked in his office, not speaking to anyone. The other wives murmured that he was receiving divine revelations, that something big was about to happen. But I saw something different in his eyes. What did you see? Fear. For the first time in all those years, I saw fear in Pastor Elijah's eyes. The man who called himself a prophet of God, who commanded 100 people with an iron fist, was terrified. Phil frowned. Afraid of what? I didn't know it at the time, but I started paying more attention, observing. After so many years living in that place, I had learned to be invisible. It was the only way to survive, so I used that to my advantage. Rachel adjusted herself in the chair, her body as tense as a violin string about to snap. One night, about 3 months before I ran away, I was cleaning Pastor Elijah's office. It was one of my assigned tasks. Only the most senior wives were allowed into that space. He had gone out to a meeting with the elders, so I was alone. And what did you find? An unlocked drawer. Something that had never happened before. He was obsessed with locks, with security, with secrets. But that night, he had forgotten. Or perhaps he wanted someone to find it. The audience leaned forward collectively, absorbed in the narrative. Inside the drawer were folders, dozens of them, each one with a name on the label. Women's names, children's names. Rachel paused, her voice faltering. My name was there, and my daughter's name, Lily's. What was in the folder? Documents, photos, dates. Everything meticulously organized, as if it were an archive, a record. Doctor. Phil, there was a photo of my daughter that I had never seen. A photo of her at 5 years old. The impact of that sentence hit the studio like a shockwave. If Lily had died at the age of 3, how could there possibly be a photo of her at 5? Doctor. Phil leaned back in his chair, processing the information. Rachel, are you telling me that your daughter didn't die? That's what I thought at the time. That's what I wanted to believe with every fiber of my being. Rachel shook her head, tears now streaming freely down her face. But the truth is more complicated. Much more complicated. Explain it to me. Inside the folder, along with the photo, was a transfer document, a form that I couldn't fully understand, but it had the name of a clinic in another state, and there was a sum of money written in the corner, $75,000. The silence that followed was absolute. Doctor. Phil had seen many things in his career, had heard stories of unimaginable horrors, but something about that revelation struck him in a different way. His jaw clenched, a sign that contained anger that few viewers would be able to identify. Are you telling me that Pastor Elijah sold his daughter? I'm saying there were 17 folders in the drawer. 17 children born in the complex in the last 15 years, all declared dead before the age of 5, all with transfer documents and values noted. In the control booth, one of the producers dropped the pen he was holding. Another was on the phone, speaking quickly with someone, probably the network's legal department. Rachel, doctor, Phil said slowly, choosing each word carefully. Why didn't you go directly to the authorities with this information? Because I didn't have physical proof. The documents were in Pastor Elijah's locked drawer. If I tried to take them from there, I would be discovered. And in the complex, anyone caught disobeying disappeared. They simply disappeared. So what did you do? I memorized everything I could. Names, dates, values. And I returned to my quarters as if nothing had happened. But something within me had changed that night. For the first time in 15 years, I felt anger. An anger that burned brighter than fear. Rachel wiped away her tears with the back of her hand, her expression hardening. In the following weeks, I began planning my escape. But I knew I couldn't leave empty-handed. I needed something, anything, that I could use to expose what was happening in that place. And that's where you found the letter. Rachel nodded slowly. It was 2 weeks before I managed to escape. My Bible was so worn that the pages were starting to come loose. When I tried to fix it, I noticed that the cover had a strange stitching on the inside. Something was hidden there. She finally handed the envelope to Dr. Phil, who accepted it with almost reverent solemnity. The paper was thick, of old quality, yellowed with age. There was something written on the front of the envelope in faded black ink, but Dr. Phil couldn't make out the words at first glance. It's in code, Rachel explained. It took me weeks to decipher. It's a simple substitution cipher, but with a peculiarity you need to know a specific key to decipher it. And what is the key? A Bible verse. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in the future. It was Pastor Elijah's favorite verse. He quoted it at every meeting. Dr. Phil carefully opened the envelope and removed a sheet of paper folded into 3 parts. The text was a seemingly random jumble of letters and numbers, incomprehensible to anyone who did not possess the decryption key. Did you bring the translation? Rachel nodded and pulled another sheet of paper from her bag. I transcribed everything, word for word. Dr. Phil picked up the second piece of paper and began to read silently. His expression, normally so controlled, began to change. First, a slight twitch of his eyebrows, confusion. Then, a clenching of his jaw, anger. And then, something the audience had never seen before on the veteran host's face, a raw, exposed vulnerability impossible to hide. The paper trembled in his hands as he continued to read. The audience waited in absolute silence, not understanding what was happening, but sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. When Phil finally looked up, his eyes were red, not from anger, from tears held back. Rachel, he said, his voice hoarse in a way no one had ever heard it before. Who else read this? Nobody. Just me. And now you, sir. Doctor. Phil closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, there was a decisive look in his gaze. Stop the cameras, he said. Now. Doctor. Phil's request caught everyone by surprise. In over 20 years on the air, he had never interrupted a recording like that. The producers in the control booth hesitated for a few seconds, unsure how to react. Had they heard correctly? I told you to stop the cameras, Doctor. Phil repeated, his voice now laden with an authority that clung to no question. And I need the audience to leave the studio. The murmur that followed was immediate and confusing. 150 people began to murmur amongst themselves, some already rising from their seats, others remaining seated in passive resistance, not wanting to miss whatever was about to happen. One of the executive producers, a gray-haired man named Marcus, rushed onto the stage with an near microphone dangling from his ear. Phil, what's going on? We can't just stop recording in the middle of Marcus. Doctor. Phil stood up, still holding the 2 papers in his hands. Do you trust me? Of course I trust you, but then do what I'm asking. Get the audience out of here, turn off all the cameras, and contact the FBI. The last sentence made Marcus recoil as if he had been physically struck. FBI. Phil, what are we talking about here, Doctor? Phil didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Rachel, who remained seated in her chair. observing the scene with an uncanny calm as if she already knew this would happen, as if she had foreseen every moment. "Did you know?" said Dr. Phil, not as a question. "I suspected as much," Rachel replied. It was the only explanation that made sense. In the audience, security guards began ushering people out, despite protests. Some spectators tried to film with their cell phones, but the security team was efficient in confiscating the devices before any images could be captured. Dr. Phil approached Rachel, sitting in the chair next to her instead of his usual interviewer position. For the first time on the tape, they were on the same level, as equals. "Tell me the rest," he asked, his voice now soft. "Tell me what else you discovered." Rachel looked at her own hands for a moment, gathering her strength. "The letter tells the story of Pastor Elijah, not the story he told his followers about divine revelations, about being chosen by God to guide the lost. The real story." And what is the real story? His name was Daniel Whitmore. He was born in Denver in 1955. When he was 8 years old, he was kidnapped by a man posing as an itinerant preacher. This man held him captive for 6 years in an isolated community in Arizona that functioned exactly like the divine light. Dr. Phil absorbed the information in silence. The cycle of abused victims becoming perpetrators was a tragically common pattern in cases involving cults and sects. Pastor Elijah, Daniel, was a victim before he was a predator, said Drive.Phil. Yes, but that's not the most important thing the letter reveals. Rachel took a deep breath. The community in Arizona where he was raised had a name. They called themselves the Children of the True Light. And the leader of that sect, the man who kidnapped Daniel when he was a child, also kept records, files, documents on every child who passed through there. And what happened to those documents? Daniel kept them all. When he finally escaped at the age of 14, he took everything with him. And when he founded his own sect decades later, he continued the tradition, not because he wanted to, according to him, but because he couldn't stop. In the control booth, now empty except for essential technicians, the cameras remain off, but the ambient microphones continued recording a decision the producers had made without consulting Dr. Phil, for reasons they would later justify as preservation of evidence. "The letter is a confession," Rachel continued, "a complete confession of everything Daniel has done over the past 40 years. Every child who was sold through his network, every payment received, every buyer. Names, dates, amounts, locations. Dr. Phil looked again at the papers in his hands, now understanding the magnitude of what he held. Why would he write that? Why risk being discovered? Because he wanted to be discovered. That's what the letter says at the end. He wanted someone to find the truth. He just didn't have the courage to turn himself in directly. And why hide it in your Bible? Rachel hesitated before answering. Because the letter also talks about me. About why he specifically chose me. About why he gave me that particular Bible. Dr. Phil felt a chill run down his spine. What does he say about you? He says he recognized me the moment he first saw me. Not as a potential spiritual wife, but as someone he knew from another life. Rachel paused, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Phil, Daniel Whitmore's original name was Thomas Morrison. Tommy, my mother's older brother. The brother who supposedly died in a car accident in 1963 when she was only 5 years old. The brother she mourned her whole life. The revelation hit Dr. Phil like a punch to the gut. Pastor Elijah, Daniel Whitmore, was Rachel's great-uncle. His own family, twisted by generations of trauma and abuse, had become trapped in a tragic cycle that culminated in that moment, in that studio. The letter ends with a list, Rachel continued, her voice now firm despite the tears. A list of 7 names and addresses. 7 children who are still alive. 7 children who were sold to families who don't know where they came from. Including your daughter? Rachel nodded affirmatively. Lily is on the list. She's alive. She's 11 years old now, and I know exactly where she is. The studio was empty now. The audience had been dispersed. The non-essential technicians had been dismissed, and only half a dozen people remained in the cavernous room. Dr. Phil, Rachel, the senior producers, a lawyer for the network, and an FBI agent who had arrived in record time after the emergency call. The agent, a middle-aged man named Patterson, sat in one of the empty seats in the audience, examining copies of the documents Rachel had brought. His face, trained to show no emotion in crisis situations, betrayed occasional micro-expressions of shock as he turned the pages. "That's extensive," he finally said, raising his eyes to Rachel. "Mrs. Morrison, why didn't you contact the authorities immediately after escaping the cult?" Rachel glanced at Dr. Phil before answering. "Because I was afraid of not being believed, of being treated as an accomplice instead of a victim, and because I needed to find my daughter first. I needed to know if she was safe before doing anything that could put her in danger." "And have you located your daughter?" "Yes. She was adopted by a family in Oregon. A family that apparently knows nothing about the real circumstances of the adoption. They believe she was an orphan from another country." Patterson nodded slowly, making notes in a small notebook. "And the other 6 children on the list? I've only been able to track down 2 of them so far. One is in California, the other in Texas. The other 4, I didn't have the resources to continue searching." Dr. Phil, who had remained silent for most of the conversation with the FBI agent, finally spoke up. "Agent Patterson, what's the procedure from here? We will open an immediate federal investigation. Child trafficking crosses state lines, which gives us jurisdiction. We will need Ms. Morrison to give a formal statement, and we will need the original documents as evidence." "And what about the complex? What about Pastor Elijah?" Patterson checked his phone, where messages were arriving in rapid succession. "We already have teams mobilizing for Colorado. If there are more victims still at the site, the priority is safe extraction." Rachel stood up abruptly, her eyes wide. "There are over 100 women there. And children. Lots of children. If you come in strong, he can. He's capable of anything. He always said he'd rather see them all dead than let the outside world contaminate his community." Agent Patterson raised his hand in a conciliatory gesture. "Ms. Morrison, our teams are trained precisely for this type of situation. We're not going to break down doors and start shooting. The safety of the victims is our absolute priority." Dr. Phil placed his hand on Rachel's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that few had ever seen him offer a guest. "Rachel, you did the right thing. You are incredibly brave for coming here and for trusting us with this information." Rachel turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't come here out of courage, Phil. I came because the letter told me to." "What do you mean?" "The final part of the letter. The part I haven't shown anyone yet." Rachel pulled another sheet of paper from her bag, this one clearly more recent than the others. The paper still white, the ink still dark. This was the last page. The one he wrote specifically for me to find. She handed the paper to Dr. Phil, who read it aloud, his voice trembling slightly. "Rachel, if you're reading this, it means you found the truth. I'm so sorry. For everything. I know apologies don't change anything. They don't erase the years I stole from you, the lies I told, the pain I caused. But there's something you need to know." Dr. Phil paused, swallowing hard. "Your daughter is alive. I couldn't sell her. When I looked into her eyes for the first time, I saw you. I saw your mother. I saw my sister, the girl I left behind when I was taken. I placed her in safety, with a family that would love her in a way I could never love anyone." The revelation caused Rachel to let out a muffled sob. She already knew her daughter was alive, the documents showed it. But knowing that the man who had held her prisoner for 15 years had, in a moment of unexpected humanity, chosen to protect the child instead of profiting from her, was something she hadn't expected. Phil continued reading. "I know you'll want justice. You deserve justice. They all deserve it. But I'm too cowardly to turn myself in. I always have been. So I'm leaving it in your hands." Go on, Dr. Phil's show. "He'll know what to do. He'll make sure the truth is heard." The presenter paused, looking at the last line of the TEXTPS. "Tell Dr. Phil that I watched his show for years. It was the only thing from the outside world I allowed in the compound. I told the followers it was to study the sins of modern society. But the truth is, I watched because I wanted to believe that there were still people in the world who cared about the truth, who cared about the victims. Thank you for being that person, Phil. And forgive me for placing this burden on your shoulders." The silence that followed was deep and heavy. Dr. Phil carefully folded the paper and returned it to Rachel, his hands visibly trembling. "He watched the program," Rachel said, almost to herself. "All those years, while I was trapped there, he watched the program. And he never let me watch. He never let me see the help was available. Because he was afraid you'd find the courage to run away," said Phil. "And he was right. The moment you found an opening, You left. Rachel nodded slowly. But why did he leave the letter for me to find? If he wanted to continue with the cult, why take that risk? Because part of him wanted to be stopped, Doctor. Phil replied, the part that still remembered being Tommy Morrison, the 8-year-old boy who was ripped from his family. He lived a life of a monster, Rachel. But monsters aren't born, they're made. And somewhere, deep down, the boy he once was still crying out for help. 6 months after that recording, the world had changed for Rachel Morrison. The FBI operation at the Divine Light compound resulted in the liberation of 137 people, including 42 children. Pastor Elijah or Daniel Whitmore, or Tommy Morrison, depending on which layer of his fragmented identity one chose to examine, was found dead in his office, a self-inflicted overdose of medication he had accumulated over the years. The letter he had left for Rachel proved to be just the tip of the iceberg. When the FBI searched his office, they found decades of meticulous documentation not only of the crimes he had committed, but also of his own victimization at the hands of the man who kidnapped him as a child. It was a file of horrors that spanned 3 generations and crossed state lines, implicating dozens of individuals who had participated in the child trafficking ring. Of the 7 children listed in the original letter, 5 were located and reunited with their biological families, a long, complex, and emotionally devastating process for all involved. The adoptive families, for the most part, were unaware of the criminal origins of the children they had raised. They too were victims in a different but equally real way. Lily Morrison, now 11 years old, was among the children found. The family that had adopted her, a retired teacher couple in Portland, Oregon, fully cooperated with the authorities and with Rachel. There was no legal battle, no resistance. They understood that Lily had a mother who had searched for her for a decade, a mother who had never given up on finding her. The reunion took place in an Oregon Social Services office 3 months after the show was filmed. Rachel had spent weeks preparing therapy sessions, conversations with family reintegration specialists, breathing exercises to control panic. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment Lily walked through the door. The girl had her grandmother's green eyes, exactly as Rachel remembered. But the rest, the way she walked, her hesitant smile, the way she tilted her head when she was curious, were traits Rachel didn't recognize. Traits that had developed during the years they had been apart. They didn't hug immediately. There was no dramatic, slow-motion chase like in the movies. Instead, they sat in opposite chairs and talked about small things at First Lily's school, the books she liked to read, the cat she had at home. Gradually, the bigger questions began to emerge. Why was I sent away? Didn't you want me? Why didn't you come get me sooner? Rachel answered each question with painful honesty, hiding nothing, not softening the truth. She owed it to Lily. She owed her the truth after so many years of lies. The Dr. Phil episode eventually aired 6 months after the original recording. The production had worked closely with the FBI to ensure that no sensitive information was released prematurely, and the final result was unlike any other episode in the show's history. For the first time, Dr. Phil appeared at the beginning of the episode, not in his characteristic studio, but in a neutral setting, sitting alone in front of a single camera. What you are about to see, he said, looking directly into the lens, is unlike anything we've ever presented on this program. It's a story of generational trauma, of cycles of abuse spanning decades, and of an extraordinarily courageous woman who chose to break that cycle. He paused, withdrawing for a moment. During the recording of this episode, I did something I had never done before in over 20 years of my career. I stopped the cameras. I asked the audience to leave, and I cried. On screen, archival footage showed the moment Dr. Phil had held the letter in his hands, his expression transforming from confusion to shock to deep, raw grief. I cried because I realized that the man who had caused so much suffering to so many women, to so many children, was himself a victim, a child who never had the chance to be saved, an 8-year-old boy who was torn from his family and transformed into something he should never have become. Dr. Phil's voice trembled slightly, but he continued, "This doesn't justify anything he did. It doesn't absolve the heinous crimes he committed, but it reminds us of a fundamental truth about human nature. Monsters aren't born. They are created, and if we truly want to fight evil in this world, we need to understand its roots." The episode then featured an edited version of the interview with Rachel, followed by interviews with cult experts, trauma psychologists, and FBI agents who had worked on the case. The audience was record-breaking not just for the show, but for the entire history of the network. In the episode's epilogue, recorded especially for the final broadcast, Rachel appeared again on Dr. Phil's stage. This time, she wasn't alone. By her side, holding her hand tightly, was Lily. "We're still learning how to be mother and daughter again," Rachel said. Her face lit up with a smile that hadn't been there 6 months earlier. "It's a process. You have good days and hard days, but we're in this together. That's what matters, Doctor." Phil leaned forward, addressing Lily directly. "And you, young lady, how are you feeling about all this?" Lily looked at her mother before answering, as if asking for permission. Rachel nodded encouragingly. "It's strange," the girl said, her voice small but firm. "I had a family, and now I have another family, and sometimes I don't know where I belong. But Rachel, my mother, she told me something that helped me." "What did she say?" "She said belonging isn't about where you come from. It's about who chooses to love you. And she chose me. Every day for 10 years, she woke up and chose me again. Even when she didn't know where I was. Even when she thought I was dead. She never stopped choosing me, Doctor." Phil felt his eyes burning again, but this time he didn't try to hide it. She let the tears flow freely as she addressed the camera for her final monologue. "I've been doing this program for over 2 decades. I've heard thousands of stories. I've seen enough pain for 100 lifetimes. But every now and then, a story breaks through all my professional defenses and hits me in a place I thought was shielded." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "The story of Rachel and Lily isn't about revenge. It's not about justice in the conventional sense. It's about something far more powerful, the human capacity to choose love even when everything conspires against it. It's about a mother who never gave up, a daughter who found the courage to forgive, and yes, it's even about a broken man who, in the end, found a way to do the right thing." Phil stood up, walking slowly towards the camera. "I stopped recording that day because I understood that some truths are too big to be processed in front of an audience. Some pains need space. Some revelations need silence before being shared with the world." He stopped, looking directly into the lens as if he could see each spectator individually. "If there's one thing I want you to take away from this episode, it's this: the truth always finds a way. No matter how many layers of lies are built, no matter how many years pass, no matter how deeply the secrets are buried, the truth is stubborn. It persists, and when it finally emerges, it has the power to heal wounds we thought were permanent." The camera began to slowly pull back as Dr. Phil finished speaking. "To Rachel, Lily, and all the survivors who found the courage to tell their stories, thank you. You are living proof that the human spirit is stronger than any chain that tries to imprison it. And to those who are still trapped in cults, in abusive relationships, in cycles of trauma that seem impossible to break, there's hope, there's help, and there are people who care." The screen slowly faded to black.